hey Justin, I want you to read this article I just sent you. It's going to change the way you see the organization. Get back to me.
Did you get that message I sent you?
Why would you send that to me? Better yet, why are you reading that garbage? It's all lies.
Garbage? How do you know if it's garbage if you haven't even read it?
Salve amici, oggi vi mostro questa seduta parlamentare in Inghilterra che si è tenuta il 17 giugno, poche settimane fa, dove un membro del Parlamento, apparentemente un ex testimone di Geova che è cresciuto nel gruppo, Sam Carling, dice di essere cresciuto nel gruppo. Finalmente abbiamo un apostata all'interno del Parlamento che ci spiega quali sono le problematiche riguardo molti gruppi religiosi, tra cui i Testimoni di Geova. Per la prima volta un parlamentare è cresciuto nel gruppo, è stato un testimone di Geova e parla di queste cose. Inoltre voglio evidenziare che anche un membro dell'opposizione, Cameron Thomas, gli fa questa domanda sull'ostracismo, quindi da questa domanda si capisce che finalmente, anche se ci vorranno molti anni per far capire come funzionano determinate cose in determinati gruppi religiosi, adesso la società in generale, politici compresi, conoscono molte cose di più riguardo a determinate faccende e comportamenti di questi gruppi religiosi. È stato un dibattito molto acceso e questo ci fa anche capire che purtroppo, e lo dico anche a tutti gli amici in Italia, specialmente all'amico l'apostataccio Stefano Fidelio che ha approvato a introdurre un disegno di legge, alcuni parlamentari comunque si sono interessati alla cosa, ma anche in altri posti del mondo purtroppo si discute su delle cose, poi questi progetti vengono sempre accantonati e quindi un po' tutte le inchieste in generale e i files in archivio vengono un po' dimenticati e purtroppo destinati a prendere polvere su alcune scrivanie.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. And may I begin by again welcoming this bill. It will deliver so much for my constituents in relation to protecting people from crime and enabling tough action on antisocial behaviour, including areas which have for too long been labelled low level and ignored, like the illegal and off-road bikes, which my constituents so often raise with me. And it will introduce mandatory reporting for child sexual abuse, one of the key recommendations from the independent inquiry into child sexual abuse, which I'll abbreviate as ICSA for the remainder of this speech. That is a long overdue measure and one long called for by our Labour Home Secretary and the Prime Minister personally. However, I remain concerned that the government is not going far enough on the issue of mandatory reporting, and that is why I have laid 3 amendments to the bill on that subject, numbers 10, 11 and 22, which my speech today will focus on. These are not intended to change government policy, quite the opposite. These amendments are intended to deliver the government's stated policy, to implement the ICSA recommendations relevant to the Home Office in full. The Home Secretary stated in January that this was the government's intention. And she reaffirmed that just yesterday, actually, in response to my question on her statement, with a firm yes, after I asked if it remained her policy to implement them in full. But there are 3 significant gaps in our plans to implement Recommendation 13 on mandatory reporting, where the bill is not delivering what ICSA recommended. With these gaps, I am concerned that the duty to report will be ineffective in some of the settings where it is most needed, religious groups in particular. And I will use the example of the Jehovah's Witnesses, the religious group which I grew up in, to illustrate how and why. They have a deep cultural distrust of secular authorities. And that leads to a culture of dealing with everything internally, as happens in a lot of different religious groups, including child sexual abuse, and reporting nothing to the police. Furthermore, their internal processes for doing so are atrocious. For example, there's something called the 2-witness rule, which means they take no action on any report of wrongdoing unless there are 2 witnesses to it. There are never 2 witnesses to child sexual abuse. I give this context to highlight why the mandatory duty to report must be absolutely watertight, as ICSA recommended, to prevent people in leadership organisations or in leadership of organisations like this from avoiding it. We have put a definition of religious leaders into our schedule in this bill, but it requires them to have, and I quote, regular unsupervised contact with children to be subject to the duty. That will allow virtually any religious leader, be they paid clergy or a volunteer elder, like in the Jehovah's Witnesses, to escape the duty, as very few have regular unsupervised contact with children, despite being in a very significant position of power and influence. And I personally happen to know at least one person who actually was sexually abused as a child in that organisation. They went to speak to religious elders about it in the presence of their parents, and not unsupervised, and they were advised that to go to the police would mean bringing reproach on God's name. So no report was made, either by the victim, their family, or those religious elders. This is commonplace. And under the bill as currently drafted, there's no sanction for that. The elders aren't mandated reporters, and even if they were, the proposed offence under Clause 73 around stopping someone else from making a report, which I very much welcome for the record, only applies to other mandated reporters. So if someone pressures a victim, or their parents, for example, not to make a report, that won't be illegal. So that offence needs to be broadened too, and I know the NSPCC are calling for the government to consider a broader offence of concealing child sexual abuse. I will give way.
Cameron Thomas.
I thank the honourable member for giving way. He's making very important points about, particularly about the Jehovah's Witness cult. And one of the methods that they use to ensure that issues like this don't escape from the organisation itself is the act of disfellowship, where an individual is threatened by being disfellowshipped all communication with their own family. And I wonder if he'll go a little further into recognising that too. Thank you.
Sam Collins.
I absolutely will, and I very much thank the honourable member for that intervention. I'm very pleased that other honourable members in the House are aware of that issue. It's something I am trying to do some work on separately. I think it's not, it is certainly relevant to what I'm discussing here. Just to give the House a little more context on that, what that essentially means is if that organisation decides that someone has committed a serious sin, it can essentially tell all of their family and friends to cut them off permanently. The same applies if they just choose to leave the religion. But very rarely is that applied to perpetrators of crimes, and more often to victims that report them. And it is an enormous problem that has to be dealt with, and I look forward to engaging with the honourable member further on that.